So we actually ran a story about this. So both the Chicago Public Library and the New York Public Library have just recently received grants from, I believe it's the Knight Foundation, to launch these Wi-Fi lending.
It's the prestigious news challenge that they both won.
Yes, exactly. And I thought I was fascinated by this, and I'm glad to hear you say that the plan in Chicago is to add to, it's not just here's your Wi-Fi hotspot and go take it home for however long. Yeah. How long will people be able to check those out for?
It's 3 weeks, and I think in New York they're lending them for multiple months, so they're sort of giving them the service. Again, this is a pilot, this is an experiment. It's something for us to learn and hopefully adapt. And we don't know if it'll be the right approach. What I do think is interesting about the hotspot lending program, and actually many of the things that hit the press, which you are, is it's often sort of the shiny objects that are coming out on the other end. And I think in Chicago, many of the things that we've been acknowledged for doing are experiments. They're not they're not services that we've committed to. They're not things that we necessarily want to do in the long term, but it's representing sort of our research and development, which is a tiny amount of the effort of our organization. But it's interesting, and I actually think it's the case in the city, is that buzz, it turns out, is important to elevating your brand while you're actually doing the more tested work at the community level, which we often don't get as much publicity for.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I guess my big question about the long-term viability of lending out hotspots for an average library, say a smaller library system in a smaller town, is whether that's really going to be affordable within the constraints of a library budget in the long term.
Well, our hope in this particular case is that it can bring, one of our hopes is that as we start looking at E-rate reform, which is a program that allows schools and libraries to submit for significant reimbursements for technology, that this could be something that would qualify as part of the E-rate reform, which we would then get a 90% discount, and it would be scalable.
Yeah.
And Sommer, I think one of the assumptions, though, is that libraries would continue doing everything they've been doing, plus lend out hotspots. I think the point is there will have to be some of these trade-offs.
Yeah.
And one might say, reasonably, that having every place make the same physical collection of books in every relevant town, or with relevant cities next to one another, Minneapolis and St. Paul or whatever, they may have to purchase less, right? And maybe the value of giving somebody a hotspot is so much greater than having the marginal works. Now, that's a controversial thing to say. It means libraries spend less from their collection budget on physical objects, which might not be good for the publishing industry, might have other kind of ripple effects. But I do think those are the kinds of trade-offs as we make this switch from a predominantly analog world to a predominantly digital world that we will have to do.
Well, and that's interesting, too, the idea that library systems would need to collaborate that are maybe geographically near each other, which isn't, maybe sometimes work in the case of the Twin Cities, they have a pretty good relationship, but in other regional systems of governments, that might be pretty complicated.
So, one of the things, I'm glad you brought that point up about the trade-offs, in particular as we're moving into the digital realm, is that our model for sharing knowledge is changing dramatically as a result of the law. And I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about for libraries, our ability to lend physical objects, so books, versus lending digital materials. It's actually very expensive, and in some cases that knowledge of that content in some ways isn't even available. And so we are having to make decisions and trade-offs about what we buy in print versus what we buy digital. And as we increasingly move into digital, one of the big questions about the future of libraries is, will we have the ability to procure and then share the leading ideas of the day? And the answer may be no.
I think the key distinction is in a physical era, we have the first sale doctrine under the copyright law, so you can take a physical book that you purchase and you can do anything you want with it. You can resell it at a secondhand bookstore, you can tear it up, you could put it on fire, you can lend it like a library or whatever. And in the digital era, there is no digital first sale doctrine, so it doesn't exist. So when a library takes things in, they're taking it in according to a contract, and that's where the publishers are saying, 26 lens or 52 lens or whatever they're suggesting. And if libraries become, instead of owners of materials, they're becoming renters or leasers of materials according to a set of contractual terms that don't include holding it forever and lending it out, libraries obviously are in a less good position. I think that's a huge and big concern going forward.